Here on Law and Disorder, we've chronicled the events of Israeli forces in Gaza. Today, we're delighted to have with us Noam Chomsky, one of the world's foremost social critics, Institute Professor Emeritus in the MIT Department of Linguistics and Philosophy, and the author of many books. Today, we talk to him about his latest, Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians. Noam Chomsky wrote Gaza in Crisis with Ilan Pappé, one of the exceptional young Israeli historians now teaching history at the University of Exeter in the UK. Noam Chomsky, welcome to Law and Disorder.
Glad to be with you.
Let's get right in and tell us why you wrote this book, why you wrote two of the major essays in the book, particularly the one that I focused on was Exterminate All the Brutes, about the war on Gaza. And give us some perspectives that you give people in the book around the war on Gaza.
Well, actually, just to be timely, let's start with WikiLeaks.
Perfect.
which doesn't, there's not very much of interest in it, frankly. But one of the interesting cables is, I think, the only one from the Tel Aviv embassy. It's to Clinton, and it discusses the, it's giving her sort of talking points, discusses the attack on Gaza. That's what it's about. And it tells her that Israel had to attack in December 2008 in self-defense because Hamas had violated the truce. Now, there's only two possibilities. Either the U.S. Embassy in Israel is so clueless that nobody even reads the press, or else they're just lying flat out, because the facts are clear and uncontroversial. In December 2008, Hamas was calling for a renewal of the truce that Israel had broken, and the Israeli cabinet considered it, rejected it, because they wanted the bomb. And I should add that's U.S.-Israel, because these are joint activities. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean, there was a truce established in June 2008. Israel never lived up to it. They insisted on maintaining the siege in violation of the truce agreement, but nevertheless, Hamas lived up to it scrupulously. Israel officially recognizes, that there was not a single Hamas rocket until November 4th. On November 4th, Israeli troops invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. There was rocket firing in response, and huge Israeli rocket firing went on for a couple of days, and as usual, the casualties were all Palestinian. Then the truce did run out in December, and then what happened is what I described. Hamas called repeatedly to even institute more rigorous truce agreements, and Israel rejected it. And then the U.S. and Israel attacked. Now, the fact that, this can pass without comment tells you quite a lot. In fact, I could go on to say that in the whole WikiLeaks episode, in my opinion, the most remarkable fact is the absolute contempt for democracy that's revealed by the embassies, by the State Department, and by the commentators. If you take a look at the leaks, the really dramatic leak that was repeated all over the place, headlines, articles, etc., is that the way it's put is the Arabs world wants us to bomb Iran, is afraid of Iran. Well, there's a minor point and a major one. The minor point is they're, of course, just citing the Arab dictators, and we don't know what they think. We don't know how the embassy officials selected or maybe invented what they wanted to hear, which is quite normal. But let's say it's all true. They are citing the Arab dictators. Many of them quite brutal. What about the Arab population? Now, again, either they are clueless and don't know a thing about the Middle East, or else they're lying. I mean, we have good studies of Arab public opinion from mainstream, very respectable sources. The Brookings Institute released its last extensive poll a couple of months ago, and it has a lot about this. It says that the Arabs do perceive a threat 88% of them see the main threat as Israel. 77% see the main threat as the United States. Iran is mentioned way down at the bottom. 10% see a threat from Iran. In fact, they're so opposed to U.S. policy that a majority, 57%, think that the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. In our intellectual culture, what the population thinks is irrelevant. What we care about is what the dictators think, or what we say they think. This is pretty striking. I haven't seen a word about this anywhere.
Going to Gaza for another second, because you'd written your chapter, I believe, before the Goldstone Report came out. This is the chapter in Gaza in Crisis,
yeah.
Exterminate All the Brutes. And I'm interested in both your reaction to the Goldstone Report and, of course, the state's reaction, the U.S. particularly.
Well, I'm kind of ambivalent about it. They did a very good job, I think, as well as you can do when you're investigating a past war. You don't have access has been blocked. Israel refused to allow them any access and so on. So they did a pretty good job, but it's inherently difficult to really demonstrate that crimes took place in battle. That you can always say, well, how do you know some Hamas gunman wasn't hiding behind a door or something? The most critical issue is the one you just discussed. Did Israel have any right to use force in the first place? Any right. Discussed almost universally as, well, sure, they have a right of self-defense. Well, that's not the issue. Of course, everyone has a right of self-defense. The question is, do you have a right of self-defense by force? And the law and common sense are quite clear about that. You don't have that right if you haven't exhausted peaceful means. And in this case, Israel refused even to try peaceful means. And the reason is they knew they'd succeed. They'd have gone back to a truce in which there were no rockets. Well, that being the case, the whole discussion's irrelevant. I mean, maybe they committed war crimes in the course of the attack. In fact, I'm sure they did, and Goldstone gives good evidence. I mean, they basically granted them a gift. If Israel wasn't so irrational, what they would have done is welcome the Goldstone Report. Thank you for agreeing with us that we were right and justified in attacking Gaza implicitly. And then they would have published a couple of thousand pages, which nobody would have looked at, going through each detail.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, the Goldstone Report does not address at all. It passes over Israel's
and we know why,
self-defense.
Incidentally. Goldstone himself had a long interview with Bill Moyers, in which Moyers asked him, what about, were they justified? He says, sure, they were justified in attacking. They just, it was disproportionate. And that's the way almost everything was reported. I mean, even the human rights groups. They just granted them the right to attack and said, well, it was disproportionate. And that's a little bit like saying that the Russian invasion of Afghanistan was disproportionate. That's not the way we deal with it.
We're speaking with Noam Chomsky, who's just published Haymarket Books, came out with Gaza in Crisis, Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. It's a very, very fine book. Noam, you were somebody concerned with Israel and its fate from the very beginning when you were a young man, just like Michael and I were visited there in the 50s, and it's been something that's been part of our lives as we've grown up and old. And it gets increasingly dismaying. What do you tell people when they ask you, what sort of solutions should we look for? One state, two state, binational state? Where are we at and what can we do?
All of them. In fact, I'd even go on and prefer a no-state solution.
I agree with that.
I don't see any reason to honor the imperial boundaries. In fact, when my wife and I were in Israel in the early 50s, we were hitchhiking up in the north, and we happened to cross the Lebanese border. And some guy in a Jeep came by and started screaming at us and told us to get back. But why have a border cutting the Galilee in half? So, and supporting all of these proposals makes perfectly good sense, as long as we recognize that you have to have a way to get there. Now, I know of only one way to proceed. If anyone has a different suggestion, I'd be happy to hear it. The only way I know is for the United States to join the rest of the world and stop its rejectionist opposition to the huge, overwhelming international consensus, agree to a two-state settlement, in which case Israel would have to go along. And then, there are details to be worked out, but the basic form of it is very well understood and accepted overwhelmingly by every relevant actor except the United States and Israel. After that, my feeling is that it would come to be recognized. Everyone in the former Palestine, mandatory Palestine, Jordan to the sea, that drawing a line through that territory makes absolutely no sense. Commercial relations would pick up, social relations, cultural relations, going across the border to a restaurant, whatever it may be. And I think the borders would erode naturally, in natural ways, actually the way that's beginning to happen in Europe. And then you could move towards a binational federation of some sort, what people call one state. And after that, you could overcome the imperial borders. Why not have integration with Lebanon?
Well, Noam, why is it that the United States defies international opinion and doesn't go along? Some people argue that it's the Israeli lobby here. Others say, no, it's in the interests of the ruling elites of the United States to keep Israel as their cat's paw. I mean, what's your view of why they don't go along?
Look, the Israeli lobby is a strong lobby, no doubt. And I really wish those claims were true. I mean, if those claims were true, it would save me a huge amount of time and effort. Literally, I could stop spending a huge amount of time giving talks and traveling and getting involved in organizing efforts and writing and so on. I could just put on a coat and tie, jacket and tie. I've got them somewhere. Go to the corporate offices of Intel, Morgan Chase, or whatever, Lockheed Martin, and explain to the Chamber of Commerce, and explain to them politely that their interests are being harmed by this little lobby that they can put out of business in 5 seconds. Then it would be over. That's the tactical conclusion from the belief that the law. Now, the fact of the matter is quite different. The strongest support for Israeli crimes is coming from the business world. I mean, the most rabid supporter of Israel in the media is the Wall Street Journal. And they're not part of AIPAC. That's the journal of the business world. The Republicans are far more extreme than the Democrats, even though Jewish votes and Jewish money overwhelmingly go to the Democrats. They're the more extreme of the two business-oriented parties. So it goes across the board. I mean, Intel, for example, is building its biggest plant in the world for new generation chips in Israel. The military industry, which has a huge lobby, of course, are delighted with Israel. So, for example, when the U.S., when Obama offers another $3 billion worth of jets, which will end up being twice that probably to Israel, does Lockheed Martin mind? In fact, they love it doubly because then Saudi Arabia comes along and says, we want something. So Obama offers them $60 billion worth of military equipment that they can't use in the biggest sale ever. So for them, it's just delightful. And in fact, the U.S. military and intelligence are tightly integrated with Israel. Actually, that goes back to 1948. I mean, there's archival material, which people are finally beginning to work on, which shows that in 1948, the Joint Chiefs of the U.S. military were pretty impressed by Israel's military efficiency and thought this could be a good base for U.S. power. It goes on. After 1967, it just took off. Furthermore, after 1967, the intellectual community, they just had a love affair with Israel. They loved this demonstration of Israeli power, and you have to remember that was right at the peak of the Vietnam War, when, despite what people claim now, liberal opinion was very upset about the fact that the U.S. wasn't winning the war. And here came Israel along, and it showed how to deal with third world upstarts. In addition to that, Israel performed a real service to the United States. There had been an ongoing conflict between radical Islamic fundamentalism, which the U.S. was supporting, the U.S. and Britain, and secular nationalism, which the U.S. was strongly opposing. It's massive. The U.S. was supporting Saudi Arabia, of course, where all the oil is. There was concern that Nasserite secular nationalism might try to gain control of the oil resources and use them for regional development, not for enriching the dictators and the West and the petroleum companies. And Israel destroyed it. It destroyed secular Arab nationalism. And that was a tremendous gift. That's when U.S.-Israeli relations really took off in their current form. Increased later, 1970, when during Black September, when the Jordanian army was slaughtering Palestinians. It looked for a while as if Syria might intervene to protect the Palestinians. The U.S. didn't want that, regarded as a threat to the oil monarchies. But the U.S. was all tied up in Cambodia at that point. They couldn't do a thing. Israel mobilized, compelled Syria to withdraw, and the massacre continued. U.S. aid to Israel, I think, almost quadrupled after that. And so it continues.
Your point was driven home to me when I was over there before the first Intifada on a National Lawyers Guild delegation with Abdin Jabara. We were investigating the Israelis snatching secular Arab leaders. These were not particularly political people, artists and writers, doctors, snatching them in the middle of the night from their homes and setting them out into the desert because these were like secular figures in the community, and they didn't want any kind of leadership.
It was way back. In fact, Israel supported Hamas in the early days. Israel used to bus students from the Islamic universities to Birzeit, a secular university, to break up student strikes and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Noam, you mentioned that when we asked about possibilities for change, that the United States really had to join the rest of the world with regard to Israel and Palestine and come down directly for a solution. And when you read now every day, it seems to me that more and more Palestinian land is just being gobbled up, both in East Jerusalem as well as in the West Bank. And, of course, we have the prison of Gaza. It seems to me getting less likely that the United States is going to do that, although world opinion is shifted even more in favor of the United States doing something. So what do you make of the current attempt to do negotiations today, of all the stuff about stopping settlements and everything you read in the normal paper every day?
Well, what you read in papers is, I'm sorry to say it, but it's just farcical. I mean, if there were serious negotiations going on, they would be run by some neutral party, and one side would be the world, and the other side would be the U.S. and Israel. I mean, that's what the conflict is. As far as what's supposed to be a conflict between the U.S. and Israel is a joke. It's about expansion of settlements. First of all, Obama's position is just repeating the wording of the famous roadmap, which is supposed to be the agreed position on steps should be taken. And the first stage of the roadmap says no expansion of settlements, even natural growth. Bush repeated that. That's, in fact, more or less his administration's plan. And Obama's repeating it. But is he going to do anything about it? Well, we know. Bush, number one, he at least imposed some very mild sanctions when Israel was expanding settlements in ways that he and Baker didn't like, cut back on loan guarantees. Obama was asked about that. So are you going to do anything about it? And his spokesperson at the press conference said, no, we're not going to impose any penalties like Bush number one did. Our position is completely symbolic. Well, that's telling Benjamin Netanyahu, do whatever you like. We'll continue funding them and give you the diplomatic support and the military support and so on. So do what you like. In other words, we're saying stop, but with a wink. Wink says go ahead. That's traditional. And now it's even more extreme. Furthermore, the whole issue of settlement expansion is a minor footnote. I mean, Israel already controls about 42% of the West Bank. And in fact, in the area that Israel totally controls, Area C, living conditions are alleged to be worse than Gaza by the international agencies that have been looking. So, yeah, maybe they'll expand it a little more, but they've already got everything they want. they can take more. Obama, in fact, just offered them more in the Jordan Valley, which they'll, of course, gladly pick up. We're already keeping Palestinians out of them. The issue is the settlements, not expansion. They're all illegal. That's understood. Israel recognized it back in late 1967. Their leading legal authority, Theodore Meron, very respected international jurist, advised them that any settlement in the occupied territories is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, the core of international humanitarian law, instituted incidentally to criminalize Nazi actions. The Attorney General in Israel, Shimshon Shapira, he agreed. He said, yes, it's illegal. Moshe Dayan, who was in charge of the occupied territories, defense minister, he agreed too. He said, sure, it's in violation of law, but the countries violate law, so we'll go ahead, which means as long as the master in Washington condemns it with a wink, who cares? That's been underscored by Security Council resolutions, by the International Court of Justice. In fact, the U.S. Justice on the court filed a separate declaration, but he basically agreed. He said that the Geneva Conventions applied to the occupied territories, meaning all settlement is illegal. In fact, not only is it illegal, but it violates any, it's designed carefully. They think it's designed carefully to ensure that there cannot be any viable Palestinian self-determination. And that's the Sharon plan. Sharon called it, he said, relief in Bantustans. And in fact, that's an exaggeration because South Africa needed the black population.
Yeah.
So they kind of... And furthermore, the U.S. and Israel, and this is crucial, for about 15 years now, have been working hard to separate Gaza from the West Bank. That is in direct violation of the wording of the Oslo agreements. And that's quite important. And by now that's virtually achieved. Well, all of this makes Palestinian self-determination almost meaningless as long as the U.S. persists in this policy.
In your book, you refer to the Palestinian Authority, or maybe Abbas, with the use of the word Quisling. Can you just explain to our listeners what that is and why you think that of the PA? Oh, it might have been Pape's. Okay.
It was his, actually.
You're right. I apologize.
Yeah, but I mean, there's something to it. In fact, just take the way they're viewed by the United States, which is what's important. Obama's point man on the Middle East is John Kerry, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He gave an important speech on this, the main speech from the administration on IsraelPalestine. It was at the Brookings Institute. He, I think about a year ago, he said that Israel, of course, had described the United States as an honest broker, trying hard and so on and so forth. But putting aside the sort of patriotic imagery, he said something important. He said, for the first time, Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner, the Palestinian Authority. And then he gave the reason. The reason is that there's an army in the West Bank run by a U.S. general, Keith Dayton. He's now been replaced. The Dayton army, it's supported by the Jordanian dictatorship and by Israel. They all take part in training it and so on. And the army, he said, has proven itself very effective. And he gives one example. During the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the army was so effective that it put down any demonstrations in the West Bank, insert any sign of opposition to the attack. And General Dayton himself later said that we were so effective that Israel was able to take forces out of the West Bank and send them to attack Gaza. Well, what's the right word for that?
Quisling. Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for being on Law and Disorder. We urge our listeners to go out and get the new Haymarket book, Gaza in Crisis, that Noam wrote along with the great Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. It's a very fine book, and people should have this on their bookshelves, and they should read it and study it. So thanks, Noam. We certainly appreciate your being on the show.
Glad to be.
Thank you, Noam. If you want to hear Law and Disorder again, or hear a segment you've missed, go to lawanddisorder.org on the web. Now you should also go to Law and Disorder Radio on Facebook. Become a friend and send Law and Disorder to your friends through Facebook.